So this past Friday, I realized there were some things on my list that I would need to get from the store. I had a quick think about it. I'm like, I think I probably ought to go now rather than waiting for Saturday because basically I think going to any store on the Saturday in December is basically an act of masochism. Right? You're basically just asking for trouble and to be really frustrated and annoyed. So I got my list together, things that I knew that I needed, and I hurried off and I got there and I found that the parking lot wasn't super full, which I was grateful for. And I got my cart, and they actually had everything that I needed, which is not something that it's something I used to be able to take for granted, right? That you would go to the store and they would actually have the things you want. Today, you can't always be sure, and it's always funny what they don't have sometimes. So I was really grateful that I found everything I wanted. I did a pretty good job of actually sticking to my list, which is always a trick in certain places for sure, especially places you like to shop. And when I got done, I got up to the checkout area and found a place, a checkout line that was actually fairly empty. There was only one person in front of me. So I had this generally really good feeling. I'm like, for a December shopping trip, I'm like winning. Like, God loves me. Jesus is clearly on my side, and I'm feeling good about it. And as I'm unloading my stuff onto the belt, I look over and to the line next to me where somebody else is unloading their stuff. And I don't know if you've ever had this moment where you look over at something that's in somebody else's cart, and you're like, wow, I really wish I had that. Right? Like, I didn't even know they had those here. Right? And I'm looking at this thing that I don't need, let's be honest, but suddenly like really, really wanted. And I had to sit there and think to myself, like, okay, what, am I going to like put all my stuff back in my basket and then leave and go get it? Like, am I going to check out and then come back? And I'm just, I keep looking at this thing and I'm like, I haven't gotten myself a Christmas present. Yet. I know you're not supposed to buy anything for yourself in December because you never know. And I'm getting distracted doing this thing to the point where, the checkout lady has to like wave me down and go, okay, it's your turn, sir. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I'm like, so I go and I check out. And, at that point, the store had gotten busier and I needed to get a move on. So I had to leave. It was amazing to me how quickly I went from, this is great, everything's great, I'm having a good day, how wonderful this is, to now I'm grumpy and mad because the thing that I didn't even know I wanted, that I didn't even know that they sold in that store, suddenly I've decided now I can't have, right? I'm upset because I can't have something that I didn't even know that I wanted when I walked in, right? And frankly, I'm a little bit jealous of the person in the line next to me who was smart enough to spot that thing and put it in their cart. Maybe you've had this similar experience. Right? I think it's actually even been called cart envy, right? You get there. And it's really funny because it really, I went from like, let's get happy, Christmas is wonderful, to like full on Grinch mode, right? Pretty much the whole drive home until I finally woke up a little bit and said, this is dumb. First of all, you're an adult man. If you want the thing, go back and get it, right? Like, not on Saturday. As human beings, there's a weird thing about us that has actually been documented over and over and over again by different people that study people. And it's this idea that human beings practice what we call loss aversion, right? And it's so much, we study it so well, we have graphs for it. Oh, and you know how I love a graph, right? And what people who study this have realized and figured out through, looking at people and what it is that we do, the act of losing something of a certain value, we experience as twice as bad as the act of gaining something of the same value. Meaning that if I were to walk down there and hand Sharon $20, she'd probably feel pretty good about that, but a little weird, right? But if I went and then took it back, she'd probably still feel a little weird, but would probably also feel twice as bad, right? So accidentally finding $10 is great. And we go, oh, that's wonderful. Lose $10 and you will tear your house apart, right? Looking for it. In fact, this is so common. Jesus talks about it in the Bible, right? Jesus talks about like the person who had 99 sheep and lost one, or the woman who had 10 coins but lost one, and how crazy she went for the one coin that she lost. We hate losing things, right? And we experience loss at really interesting moments, right? At that moment in the checkout, I was experiencing loss, right? Even though I didn't know that I was something I wanted in the first place, but now somehow I felt like something had been taken from me, even though nothing was taken from me, and it didn't feel good at all. And the truth is, if I go back and buy that thing, it's probably not going to feel as good to buy it as it did to feel like I lost it. We don't like losing things. We have an aversion to things, and if we think something's going to cost us something, if we think something's going to take something from us, no matter how good it might be, if we think something's going to take something from our lives or from ourselves or something from us, no matter what the upside might be, we tend to get pretty upset about it. That is what's happening in the story today. Herod is feeling a sense of loss, or anticipating, not even feeling it yet, he's anticipating feeling a sense of loss by these men who have come from the east, wherever that is, to tell him that there is a new king of his area that had been born. Now, this is a problem for Herod, of course, because he's the king, right? And it took a lot for him to become the king. Herod is an interesting character in history. Herod the Great, really, he served from about like 70 BC to around like 1 or 2 AD. That was his section of his reign. And he's very well documented in history, and a lot of historians aren't quite sure what to do with him and where he stands. Because on one hand, Herod built a lot of stuff, right? He built a lot of big, impressive stuff. If you've been lucky and been to Jerusalem and been to the Western Wall, which is all of the temple that remains, that wall was built by Herod. Because one of the things that Herod did was greatly expand the temple in the first century BC. It was one of his great building projects that he did that he hoped would, garner some excitement amongst the people. So when we see depictions of the temple, and we think about the temple that Jesus ran around in and did his ministry in, that was Herod's temple. And he greatly expanded it, and he made it a lot nicer and a lot shinier. One of the things I have to remind myself of, because when we think of that part of the world and old buildings in that part of the world, usually we think of the ruins that were left, right? Not so. When Jesus was around, that building was actually fairly new. Right? It was only 50 or 60 years old at that point, which is not that old for basically a building made out of rock, right? So Herod built that, and he built some other stuff. So on that hand, we kind of think he might have been, some people think he might have been okay, except building things costs money. And so where Herod, of course, got his money is he taxed people, and he taxed them quite a bit. And so it's also probably well understood that because of Herod and how he taxed people, that was part of the reason why everyone in that area was as poor as they were, because they were the ones actually funding all of these building projects. Now, Herod got his position from his dad, who was an important guy in the Roman world when the Romans first came over, and his dad actually got his position from Julius Caesar himself. So it's Herod, Herod's dad, Julius Caesar. Herod's position was actually confirmed later on by Mark Antony. And I always have to remind myself that those people were actually real people, right? I mean, we've made so many movies about him and read, so many things about, Julius Caesar and all these people that you sometimes kind of forget that they were actually real folks. But they were. And so Herod has this kingdom. He's the king of Jerusalem. He actually ended up having to take it by force. One of the rings from the previous king with Mark Antony's support. And oh, by the way, he killed most of his family members to make sure they wouldn't challenge his position. So he built nice stuff and was a murderer. So I'm going to go maybe not the best guy, right? I think we can probably, that's where I would land on the how do we think about Herod debate. So this is Herod's history, and he's actually towards when the wise men show up, which we think was somewhere around like 4 BC. Whoever figured out when year 1 was actually kind of missed the mark by about 4 or 5 years, we figure. So it's probably about 4 BC that Jesus was born, and the wise men show up, which would have been towards the end. Herod only reigned for another few years before he died, actually very painfully. And so these wise men show up and they tell him, so when they say, hey, we're here to worship the new king that has been born, it is somewhat understandable why Herod is concerned about this, right? Because he hasn't had any children lately, right? If there's going to be a new king, I'm sure he would have assumed it would have been his, right? Because that's how it worked in those days. And so he's concerned, and he starts immediately anticipating the loss that will come to him if it is true that there is a new king being born, right? The loss not only to him, but his family and his children who he expects to inherit what he does. So when the wise men come and announce this thing to Herod, the scripture tells us that he is greatly disturbed, and all of Jerusalem is disturbed with him. We can sometimes misunderstand that verse, because Herod's disturbed because he thinks there's an opportunity he may lose his kingdom, he may lose his kingship, he may lose everything that he thinks is valuable, is important. And the people of Judea are concerned because Herod is the kind of king that you don't want mad, right? He's the kind of king that when he gets mad, people die, right? Whether it's the right people or the wrong people. So they're not disturbed that Herod may not be king anymore. That's not why the people are disturbed. They're disturbed because basically their not so benevolent dictator may suddenly be in a bad mood, and that doesn't work out well for anybody. In many ways, and in fact much bigger ways, Herod is really the original Grinch, right? He's basically trying to stop Christmas before it even starts. Right? He can't see beyond his own sense of loss. He can't see beyond where and how this may affect him. He can't see beyond any of that. And even though he himself is a practicing Jew, someone who goes to the temple and knows the prophecies and knows that a Messiah is supposed to be coming at some point and knows all the stories and his himself should be anticipating as much as anyone else, he can't even imagine all of that, what the coming of a Messiah may mean for his people, what it might mean for God's work. He cannot think of any of that. He can only think about himself and what he might lose. So in many ways, he is the original Grinch, if only he was wearing green robes. All right. So we are going to talk about the Grinch too. So this is the Grinch that most of us probably know. And we are specifically talking about the animated special, which I must confess is not actually a movie, right? And I know we said the series about movies. The original animated special for the Grinch wasn't actually a movie. It was a TV special. It was a TV special actually made by CBS the year after they made the Peanuts special, which turned out to be a really great success. You know, what's interesting is the Peanuts special actually got really literally peanuts to be made with. They got a very small budget to make that, but it was such a successful show that when Grinch came along, they actually tripled the budget the next year to make the Grinch special that they made the other one. Now, Dr. Seuss, who was still very alive and well and writing at this time, wasn't sure that he wanted to do this. Wasn't sure that they actually wanted to make a movie out of one of his books. He had tried to make a movie before. It didn't go very well. He didn't really seem to like people in Hollywood all that much. So he was a bit of a downer on it for a while. And it wasn't until his friend that he had actually worked with in World War II. They were cartoonists together in World War II making safety films, because apparently that's what you do. And who was also the guy who animated Bugs Bunny and all of that. Right? So when that guy came onto the project and he was going to be the animator and he was going to be part of it, Dr. Seuss finally agreed and said, okay, we can make a movie out of this. And not only did they get this guy, whose name is honestly escaping me right now, the animator guy, they decided they really wanted to get some big name voice talent. So does anybody know who voices the narrator and the Grinch in the movie? It is Boris Karloff. Yeah, the guy, the original Frankenstein's monster, who in the 1960s was still a pretty big deal. So they got, that's how they spent some of that money they got from CBS, I suppose. And so they got him, and then they also made one important change. Now, they were really, the movie is very close to the book, right? They had to pad it out a little bit because the book isn't that long, so they added a little bit of scenes here and there just to kind of stretch the runtime into the full half hour they needed. But they made another really important change in the book that we still live with today, or in the movie. We still live today. Anybody know what it is? The change they made for the movie is that they made the Grinch green. In the original book, he is not green. He is, in fact, white, as you can see here. If you find an older copy of the book, this is what the Grinch looks like. In modern copies, he's now green. They did this because this was 1966, and color TV was still a really big newfangled idea. And so CBS wanted some more color into it to show off the colorness of the color TV. So they changed the Grinch from white to green. That has nothing to do with the sermon. I just thought it was interesting. So now you have a little trivia to take to your next holiday party, right? When you're at Christmas dinner, it's like, did you know? I'm like, there you go. That's my gift to you. So color was new, and actually the Grinch, the show itself actually did win an award, but not one you might think. It actually won a Grammy. And it won a Grammy for Best Children's Album because they made an album version of the show. So it's a Grammy Award-winning cartoon about Christmas. There you go. Now, in the story, we have the central character is obviously this character named, who is named the Grinch. And when we're introduced to him, we learn that he kind of lives apart from all of these other people, the Who's in Whoville. He's lived up there for 53 years. Apparently never came down, never introduced himself, or anything like that. And for 53 years, every year, he would get upset at the noise coming out of the village during Christmas time because it was just too joyous and cheerful, and it made him mad, right? He just couldn't handle all of the joyful and cheerfulness that was happening down there. And ostensibly, we know probably why, because he wasn't a part of it, right? And so for literally 50 years, well, not literally because it's a pretend book, but you know what I'm saying. For 50 years, apparently, he watched this and he finally decides to take action into his own hands. And he's like, I need to do something different this Christmas. Something has to change. And of course, he decides to do the logical thing, which is if there's too much joy, we will just go and steal all the joy, right? Because that's what you do, apparently, when you're just a grumpy old green guy. So we all know the story. Hopefully he goes down, he takes all the stuff, he puts it on his sleigh, and he takes it back up to the mountain, and then, of course, is at the end of the book surprised when the Who's of Whoville get together and they still sing their songs and they still have a good time despite the fact that their trees are gone and their roast beast is gone, which sounds delicious. And all the Who hash is gone, and yet they can still come together and they can still enjoy the holiday, they can celebrate Christmas with one another, and they can still be joyous. And of course, that's the moment when the Grinch realizes he had messed something up. And the thing that he had not accounted for is where it is the joy that the Who's in Whoville felt came from. He thought it came from all the exterior stuff, the trees and the lights and the decorations and the food. The Who's knew something different, that it came from somewhere else. So, of course, then we get the scene where the Grinch descends down with his sleigh full of ill-gotten gains, redistributes them to whoever it is that took him from. And then if you remember that, the line that we were given at the end there, is he actually joins in them, and the Grinch himself carves the roast beast, right? Now, Dr. Seuss was actually inspired to write this because he thought and believed that this was a story about himself. He was standing in his bathroom on the 26th of December in what we would now call today a very Grinchy mood. He was unhappy. He was unhappy because his wife was sick, and his wife actually dealt with chronic illness her whole life. He was unhappy that she was sick and wasn't feeling good. He was unhappy about the commercialization of Christmas in 1955. boy, howdy, buddy, hold on. You don't even know what's coming yet. And he found himself in this bad mood. He found himself in this terrible mood. He found himself staring at the mirror in the bathroom. And he's like, and that was the moment that he said he was inspired to write this story. And it was the fastest thing he'd ever written. It was the easiest thing he'd ever written. And he wrote it in about 6 weeks, which is faster than he ever did anything. And the only problem he had was the ending. He didn't know what to do with the ending. And if you read the book, you notice that it just sort of ends. Right? He gives back the stuff and suddenly he's sitting there, right? And he couldn't figure out, he said he wrote like 5 or 6 different endings to the story that were a lot more involved than the actual ending we got. But he decided that he just couldn't make any of those things work and he just left it the way that it was. That somehow, because his heart grew 3 sizes that day, as we were told, and he could find the joy of the season, he found himself in the midst of the people, enjoying the people that he had held himself apart from for 50 years. He found himself joining in the joy that had annoyed him for half a century. And what Dr. Seuss decided is that was in and of itself enough, right? Showing that scene was enough, and it told you everything you needed to know about the Grinch and what happened to him. Herod wouldn't be as lucky as the Grinch. Herod wouldn't figure out what it is that the wise men were actually on about. And in fact, Herod would go so far, if you keep reading in the story, to do something fairly tragic and awful. Herod can't get it, won't see past only the things that he's afraid to lose, can't see the good and the joyful thing that God is trying to do. Christmas offers us a lot of opportunities. It allows us the opportunity to get together. It offers us the opportunity to have fun. It offers us the opportunity to give and receive gifts. It offers us the opportunity to show those we love. It offers us the opportunity maybe to make up with that person you've been arguing with. Christmas offers us so many important opportunities. And yet, most of us spend our time and fill our time this season with things that are anything but. We fill our time with the busyness and all the trappings and all the other things. And there's nothing wrong with Christmas trees. There's one at my house. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But if we don't also remember and cherish what this time is for and what it is that we are supposed to be doing, and we don't put ourselves in the mindset of the Grinch after his heart grew, then quite frankly, we're missing the point. Because it's very easy for us to look at the world, look at our Christmas, and think about all of the things we don't feel we have. All of the ways where this Christmas isn't as good as last Christmas, or this Christmas isn't as good as I remember it being for kids, and these kids today are so ungrateful and blah, 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 blah. We can do that to ourselves, and we do it fairly easily. We can fall into that mentality, and yet I do not believe we should. Each Christmas, each time we come to this time of year, is unique and it is his own. Our families usually look a little different every time we gather, and that's just the part of things, and that is the way of life. Our call and our challenge is to live into the joy, to look for the joy, to participate in the joy, to not hold ourselves apart, to not stare at things from a Grinchy distance, and to not focus on the things that we don't have, but focus on the fact that I got a decent parking spot, and the line for checkout was short, and I got to take the things that I was buying home to prepare wonderful things for my family. We can all do that same thing and make that same choice. So this season, let's not be Grinches, even though we might want to be. Let's not focus on what we don't have. Let's do what the Grinch did at the end, allow God to grow our hearts, and stay in the joy and the peace of the season. Amen.